Hello and welcome to the first proper episode of the New Dogs Old Tricks podcast. So it is Friday, just gone 12, and we are beginning to record the first episode, and it is on today. Sully, would you like to take it away?
Yeah, it's on existentialism and the realm of thought that is. So yeah, welcome to the podcast.
Yes, we're looking forward to hopefully having a few listeners. I hope you enjoy it today. So we're going to be taking a bit of a dive into what is existentialism from its origins in 18th and 19th century philosophy, especially around religion, from the likes of Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, through the transition through Heidegger and Husserl. Not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but we'll find out if he comes and contacts me. Except he's dead, so he can't. So that's a bit of a victory myself. And then we'll go all the way to Sartre, De Beauvoir, Camus, and look at where it is today, because that's an interesting thing. You don't have many famous existentialists on TV anymore, like you would have back in the day with Sartre and De Beauvoir and the like. So we'll bring it up to relevance. And look, we've started reading about existentialism in the last months or so. So look, much like you, we're just pretty amateurs at this. We're not going to be giving you a all highbrow, supremely intellectual take on it. We're going to be looking at this. We're going to be talking about the terms, what they mean, and thinking about it philosophically. But don't be worried, this is going to be an easy breaking into the ideas of existentialism. So, without further ado, would Miss Solomon, would you like to take it away a bit? Although I can chip in, and we'll start off with what is existentialism and where does it come from?
Yeah, so existentialism in its purest form is just a study of, essentially, from the human perspective, why we're here and what is our purpose. Because for most of human history, we've tried to run away from the issue of what our purpose is as humans through running to science or the rational. But during the 18th and 19th century, and particularly the 20th century, we started to look at the human condition from a personal perspective. And that is what existentialism is. It's looking at the questions of what is our meaning and what is our purpose. And this has origins in thinkers like Nietzsche and Kierkegaard. Particularly Nietzsche's idea that God is dead, because Nietzsche believed that the Enlightenment era caused the phenomenon in which our Christian values of constantly seeking truth ended up in us actually destroying religion and our presuppositions about it. In constantly looking for truth inspired by religion, we ended up discovering the scientific laws of the world in many regards, making us have a less solidified belief in God. And that's where Nietzsche's idea of the values have devalued themselves comes from. And Nietzsche feared of a crisis, actually. He feared a crisis because he realized that with the idea that God is dead, there's no God to guide us. Humans have to find their own meaning. And in that idea of Nietzsche fearing a crisis, Nietzsche actually predicted the rise of nationalism and of the tragedies in the 20th century, and that's where the origins of those trains of thought come from. And there's also
can I mention Kierkegaard?
yeah,
I'm sure
yeah,
you're going
and
to get onto it.
there's also Kierkegaard, and I'll leave it to you to talk about Kierkegaard and his origins.
So Kierkegaard was a Danish, I would say philosopher, but that's kind of a redefining of him that he would actually kind of reject, which we'll get onto later. He could sort of himself as more of a poet. He wrote under pseudonymous works, which were only uncovered to be his later on. And he was still religious. He still believed in God, but he had this idea that what was actually more important than just blindly following the rules of Christ or God or whatever aspect of Christianity, which was his religion. You thought the best way to actually find yourself was to go to God authentically of your own volition, rather than just to be, baptized, go to church every week, and so on. So he had a lot of antipathy towards the Danish church, which was very institutionalized. I think one of his quotes was, or it might have not been him, but that if they found out that Jesus Christ was a fraudster, it wouldn't affect how the church ran. There would be no change. The bishops would still collect their rich payment, and they would still live in their lovely houses. And he was very critical of that. He thought that religion was something that you came to yourself, and that related to his also hatred to, not hatred, but animosity. He saw himself as the enemy to one of the other big philosophers of the time, Hegel, who was known across the continent for trying to devise a very complicated rational system of dialectics that would cover the whole of human existence. And Kierkegaard felt this wasn't possible, that you couldn't confine human existence down to just rationality and text alone. And so, he thought of the human as being something that was subjective and individual, and our relation to society and to God was something that could only be done through personal choices and actions, rather than through blind following or through some attempt to scientify, as it were, to try and turn everything into reason and rationality, when the human experience fundamentally isn't around that. It is of its own kind. Have you got anything else to add, Sully?
Yeah, I think that's very true, and I think that actually allows us to develop into the next section of what we're going to talk about, which is what the main tenets of existentialism were and what connected all these thinkers. Because in Kierkegaard's idea of the subjectivity of experience and how we cannot unify all we know about the world in a simple theory like the dialectic, and how human experience is individual. Sorry, go ahead.
May I just interrupt? If you're not aware of what the dialectic is, it's a form of... I should have explained this myself a bit better. But it's a form of philosophical argument. And Hegel... so you have the first point, the thesis, meets the antithesis, which matches it, which kind of contradicts it, and then you get the creation, the synthesis, and that's a process which it was first created by the Greeks as a form of dialogue thousands of years ago, but Hegel kind of worked out into this whole historical pattern of the world and how we were going to end up in these kind of liberal capitalist states by the end, and he built this whole system around dialectics which covered the whole world. Kierkegaard didn't reject the usage of them in the natural sciences, but he didn't think that you could confine human behaviour and experience to them. Sorry, you carry on. I'm just conscious of the fact that there's some stuff that we may have been discussing that you may not be aware of.
Yeah, I think you summarised the dialectic pretty well. Just to reiterate it though, because I think there's, in very simple terms, Hegel was he was an idealist. He was one of the German idealists, and they emphasised the role of ideas in driving history. Mm-hmm. And the dialectic is an echo of that. The dialectic is just this idea that human history is ultimately the clash of one idea with another, causing a synthesis and a new idea to be born, a new history to be born. And from that, obviously Kierkegaard didn't reject that, but he didn't like this idea of speaking of history in absolute terms. And that links to the existentialist idea of freedom and the importance of approaching the world from our perspective rather than from an absolute or rational perspective that doesn't properly appeal to our fundamental questions about our existence.
Yeah, we look at existence from the inside. We're not this neutral third party observing us like a surveillance camera would. And thus we have to respond to questions over our existence and our being from that, rather than trying to falsify our results and imagine that we are looking at it from the outside. So should we get on to the themes then? I'm sorry, you were mentioning it and then I interrupted you and we've been on a bit of a tangent, but Sully.
So I'll cover some of them and I'll leave the rest to you. But I think to me the main themes are, of course, freedom, which we've already covered. But it's just essentially this idea that when you encounter the fact that there's no inherent meaning provided to you by the transcendent, the idea of a god, you then are left with this issue of everything is in my hands. I can do anything. I can change the future. I can change my future. And that's the idea of freedom. This links to Sartre's later ideas of existence preceding essence, but we'll cover that later. There's also this idea of existential dread, which is this idea of that once you confront and stop running away from the reality of your existence, you'll feel massive anxiety. For example, when you confront something that we talk about later called the absurd, which is the conflict between the tendency for humans to constantly ask questions and the cold silence of the world. In that, we feel anxiety, but existentialist thinkers thought that anxiety is actually what drives our development as people, this idea of authenticity, because even in this world which seems to have no definite meaning, what existentialist thinkers valued above all else was the idea of being authentic, the idea that we don't conform only to societal pressures, we don't conform to what they called the crowd, which is just other people. Instead, we try and be authentic, which is the idea of developing our individual virtues, our individual values, and being ourselves wherever possible. And those are the ideas of authenticity. And if you want to, Tom, you can cover the idea of facticity or whatever else.
Yeah, so I think you've done a very good job there in covering the past ones. So you feel this angst and this dread because of the fact that everything you produce is your own responsibility. There's no big themes covering it and driving you on like some connection to God. It is your fault for everything you do, and you've got to weave your way through life, projecting into the future, but also remembering into the past of the things that limit you. And the things that limit you are facticity. So facticity, and this relates to the other theme of situatedness, are the kind of things that weigh you down. You still have this undeniable freedom. You still have this ability to make choices of your own accord, but nonetheless, the facticity itself not so much impinges, but is rather it provides the context for the decisions that you make. So it could be stuff like your race or your your ability, so whether you're disabled or not. It could be the historical period you live in, or your class, or the education you received. None of those, even if you have, you're very limited by that. You're poor, or you lived in a period of history when there weren't very many opportunities. You still had the ability to make choices, which is kind of a radical doctrine. This is according to existentialists. But nonetheless, the facticity frames the choices that you make, and every second that you exist, you are creating new facticity for yourself. And if you imagine yourself kind of flying through history, and out of your exhaust, you produce this past which changes subtly your future. It doesn't change your future, but it provides this backbone for where you're going to. And it's that kind of process where you're constantly creating this past behind you that is changing or limiting, not your freedom, but limiting the kind of choices you can make. There's that kind of weaving and oscillating that is a common theme throughout existentialist text. So situatedness, it relates to that. Perhaps the best way of putting it is, it's kind of the old Marxist thing of men do not choose their own history, but they can create it in the future. So you didn't choose to be born. You didn't choose to be born at all. You didn't choose to be born to your specific parents and the specific circumstances you live in. But nonetheless, you have the ability to change the future as you go. And did we cover absurdity? Sorry.
I covered it. Like, I covered the idea of what absurdity is. I think we've covered it decently enough.
Yeah, that's good. Right.
You want to move on to Kierkegaard and Nietzsche then?
Okay. So, we shall now go into a bit of a deeper dive into specific philosophers. I'm not speaking very well today. I might have to cut this out afterwards. We're going to go into a bit of a deeper dive into various philosophers and their particular takes on various parts of existential thought. So the first two are the kind of early ones who didn't necessarily call themselves existentialists, but looking back on them, we've kind of given them that label. Of course, that is very antithetical their own views on philosophy, because what we're doing is we're objectifying them and we're not allowing them their free ability to define themselves. But nonetheless, we're going to do it anyway. We're not necessarily existentialists, so we don't care that much about that. And we're trying to make this podcast, so it would be very boring if we went, well, you just have to say what they all said and read it yourselves. But nonetheless, we'll get onto them. So, first ones, we've kind of covered them a bit in the origins, and so this one be briefer, especially briefer compared to the stuff we'll go on Sartre and Camus. But Kierkegaard and Nietzsche are the two main ones we're going to be discussing now. So, Kierkegaard, as we've said, was a person who believed in that subjectivity is the truth, that what ultimately mattered to our existence is this idea that existence itself is subjective. There is no objective truth to the way in which you live. There's no objective truth in the way you see and perceive the world. So his main kind of schools of thought, there's obviously, you can go more deeper into the individual, the deep properties of how he considered the world, but one of the biggest contributions he made was the idea of the realms of existence. Not the realms, the spheres of existence. So, he was very interested in how people live. That's one thing we kind of didn't mention, which was that of all philosophical schools, the existentialists very much lived their philosophy. They were very like the Greek philosophers in the fact that they lived out their philosophy rather than just doing it abstractly. So Kierkegaard, who was interested in how we live, looked at how people interact with each other in the world and argued that most people, especially the young, live in what he called the aesthetic sphere of existence. And this is one where you don't make the choices for yourself. You go and live by the words of others and the thoughts of others, but also following different motives rather than your authentic choice. So you choose things that make you happy. You might experiment with romantic partners when you're younger, or you might take drugs or start smoking because it makes happy, rather than making that choice for yourself authentically and considering how it affects you and the way you live in general. So I think he considered that most people live in this sphere of existence. So, if I just read through my notes a little bit. Yes, sorry. He then thought that it wasn't so much of a progression from one sphere to the next, but it was an idea that there was another sphere of existence that you could live in, which was the ethical. So this was one where you made these choices for yourself, and you consider things for their moral worth rather than being driven kind of almost hedonistically by what invited you. and that was something you came to as somewhat as an individual, but you're still often led in the ethical sphere by institutions such as the church or other forms of moral leadership. The last sphere of existence, however, was the religious, and this is where his themes as being one of the, not few, but one of the minority, perhaps, of existentialists, but him also being a theist, that is someone who believes in God, comes in, because he felt that the thing that truly makes the individual subjective, that shows that it is their choice rather than the choice of others choosing for them, which we'll get on, which is how people live in the aesthetic and the ethical to some extent, but not as much. The religious relies on you taking this leap of faith, the idea that you can you reject any attempt to reason or rationalize your connection, but rather just leap off into this subjective and personal experience with God. So unlike the ethical, which places everyone on this universal moral standard, you place the individual above the universal, I think is one of his quotes. And you look at what helps you look at how your individual and subjective connection relates to God. That connection is something that you as an individual build rather than God building for you. And that was how he considered the kind of the utmost form of existence, where you have best conceived how to live, because you have admitted your subjectivity and you've come to God of your own accord rather than just living through it as many people do. I've spoken for quite a long time actually, so I should probably leave Sully to talk about niche, and I'm sorry for taking a while.
No, don't worry about it. I think just to add to Kierkegaard, I think another interesting thing to add is that Kierkegaard was actually the originator of this idea of the absurd, and that is something that the absurdist thinker Camus will later criticize him on, actually, because Kierkegaard was this close to properly recognizing the absurd and accepting it. And the absurd is this idea that we can constantly ask questions but never get an answer from the world. Kierkegaard was so close to just recognizing that and accepting that, but he's criticized later on for taking this leap of faith that Tom talked about, which is trying to reject the absurd by looking beyond this world, looking towards the irrational, looking towards the transcendent. And I think that's another idea you can add to Kierkegaard. Now,
definitely. Yeah. If we talk about Camus, which we will do, it is a form of philosophical suicide.
Yes.
And we'll get onto that later, and we'll explain how that relates to Kierkegaard. You go on. You talk about niche.
So niche, we've already covered mostly. We've covered his idea of God is dead in Crisis, and the idea of that he predicted a crisis in the future, as humans don't really have a definite meaning, and so they would scramble to try to find their own meaning, and inevitably fail, as Nietzsche would assume. And obviously he preceded the rise of nationalism and the issues in the 20th century of mass political movements such as the failure of Soviet communism, etc. But we've already covered that, and I just want to cover some of the last few things about niche, which are this idea, first of all, of the herd. And in existentialist philosophy, because it focuses so much on the individual, on the self, it has a strong theme of looking towards everyone around us as something called the other, or something called the herd, or the crowd, or whatever else you want to call it. But this has foundations in Nietzsche's philosophy of the herd, and of him saying that authentic experience, as we've talked about before, is actually in rejecting the herd and developing one's individuality. And another big idea of Nietzsche's is that of the Übermensch, and you might have heard of this before, but this is the idea that Nietzsche was very much dissatisfied by the nihilism that came about from the idea that God was dead. He was dissatisfied by it, and he was the purest. He's likely the purest nihilist to date, because Nietzsche didn't himself look for a solution to this issue. Instead, he tried to navigate it through this idea of an Übermensch, and Nietzsche hoped for this idea of an Übermensch, which has been translated in English as something like an overman, or like a superman, something that will exceed the essence of man and be even better than it, in the sense that Nietzsche hoped for someone that would see the lack of meaning in the world and shatter that idea to pieces by developing his own meaning, purposes, and values, and that would be the perfect human in Nietzsche's eyes, and that very much links to what the existentialists later on tried to develop, which was this idea that yes, there may be no meaning in the world, but let's go out and make it for ourselves. And this is essentially where this pivotal idea comes from. Nietzsche's Übermensch and trying to. Camus later talks about how can we exceed nihilism from within nihilism, and that's really fundamental to the ideas of Nietzsche. And I think we've covered Kierkegaard and Nietzsche there, so maybe we want to generally cover people. We want to cover next generally people like Sartre and De Beauvoir, but we would like to talk about what happens in between these two realms of thought, the pre-existentialists and the 20th century existentialist. And in recognizing that, I think we should talk about people like Husserl and Heidegger. So I can leave that to you if you have any ideas about intentionality or whatever else.
Oh yeah, so I that was a great thing on Nietzsche. I think it's quite ironic how his ideas and nihilism in general have been taken by a group of people that kind of reject his whole trying to find a solution to it, and just think, oh, I'd like to kill the world, whatever. Yeah. But if we get on to these people, kind of crossed the boundary. I mean, Husserl was really not a existentialist, but he was a phenomenologist. But it was his ideas of consciousness that kind of helped Sartre and De Beauvoir later on. So he saw consciousness not as this kind of material process occurring within your brain, but almost as a nothingness, kind of a flashlight that you point at what you perceive, and his idea of intentionality, the conception that we do not just experience things, but we experience things as something. So I experience a rock as heavy rather than just experiencing its weight objectively is very important, and it relates into later ideas of Sartre's and kind of the objectification that goes on in the world, and the way in which we do projects, which is another thing we'll get onto when we get to Sartre, I think. We don't just do things; we do things, and they become other things in the future. So if I write a book, I create meaning as I write it, or we do a podcast, we create meaning as we record it, rather than just doing it without meaning. And so that relates the fact that we create this meaning through our choices is very key to how we kind of resolve the fact that we exist in this world, but we do not have any pure objective essence. Would you like to talk about Heidegger? Because by the way, just like to say, since Heidegger perhaps most famously was a bit of a Nazi, we're none of this podcast is endorsing any of these figures or their actions, but we're just trying to evaluate them and their ideas on their own merits.
Heidegger owes a lot to what we nowadays do in philosophy, as well as most of 20th century philosophy. And he did take Heidegger directly took from Husserl, who took from thinkers before him that were pre-existentialists, as well as just the field of phenomenology that he essentially founded. But Heidegger has a lot of work, and it's very dense, and it's at times obscure. So I will never be able to cover it in its totality. But some of the big ideas that he contributed...
There's a lot of very long German words which are very hard to pronounce, which isn't helping.
Yeah, exactly. He has a massive set of vocabulary that he defined and refined for philosophy. So in that sense, he was quite influential, but hard to read. But some of his big ideas that I think are important here are Heidegger had this idea that authenticity, which we've talked about before, though we talk about the role of the individual in we're constantly chasing the crowd in modern day life, but that strips us of our individuality. And Heidegger said, yes, you must look for individuality, but you also, in being authentic, one must also recognize the influence of society on the individual, and that it's inauthentic to pretend like there are no social influences on yourself. And this is what he called the idea of being with, or Mitsein. So that was a massive idea he contributed, and it developed the idea of authenticity, which nowadays, well, at the end of existentialist philosophy, people started actually seeing authenticity as inevitably tied to cooperation and working with others, which we'll see later. There's also the idea of Geworfenheit, which is we will see later in Sartre's idea of, I think, the desert. I think you mentioned one time, the idea that with the Geworfenheit is this idea from Heidegger that we are thrust into the world without any meaning, this like forceful action, and that though we are thrust into the world and left to deal with it ourselves, deal with the absurdity of the human condition, we must go and find the meaning, and that's another thing that Heidegger contributed. And he also had this idea that Dasein, which is his, it's almost like an anthropomorphization, if whether it's called, of the human spirit and of existence, and he saw that existence and the world are together in this unity, and that you can only understand existence in relation to the world and vice versa. And that was an interesting idea. So yeah, I think that covers the transition sort of period, because from Heidegger, Sartre developed his ideas, and all the other existentialists developed their ideas from Sartre. So we can start to cover Sartre now, I think.
Yeah, so Sartre and his romantic and philosophical partner De Beauvoir were perhaps the most famous existentialists ever, and they were around from the kind of as thinkers from kind of the 1930s to the 1960s and 70s. So, well, they had. They were inspired, obviously, by Husserl and Heidegger and Kierkegaard and Nietzsche, and they had a very developed and interesting take on existentialism. So, perhaps the best quote, I think, that perhaps sums up all of existentialism is one of Sartre's, which is that existence precedes essence. So again, you see that theme that the world that we exist in is not, there's no grand plan for us all, there's no intentions that we must follow and reach, but rather we have to make those ourselves. So another theme that Sartre wrote about was this freedom, the fact that we do have, as humans, this, well, he saw it as undeniable. We'll get onto some criticisms of that later. Freedom to act and do what we want. Nonetheless, though, we are limited by this facticity, which are the social position and the society in which we live in, and like as I've explained before. But we have to transcend, as he put it, beyond this notion, this facticity, and overcome it each time. But the problem was that, as is written about in a lot of it, is that every time you make this choice, you are creating more facticity in the future. If I choose to take up a job, then that job might be limiting me if it has a bad contract or something like that. And so he considered life and the way of resolving the fact that existence precedes essence as kind of a narrow kind of oscillation between this transcendence and this continually being formed facticity, which are the things that limit you. They don't limit you as much as they place context in the world around us. But we can get on to kind of the more material aspects of him. But I think one thing that's also interesting is the way he applies this Husserl's phenomenology to his philosophy. And the fact that when you this intentionality of action, when I make my project, for instance, to do this podcast, I'm free to do that. I've got this freedom. I'm making that. But in the future, I have made this commitment to a future end, which is limiting me as a consequence. I now have said that I am doing this, and thus I'm providing myself less freedom. So again, you are following, because you are making something of something else. You are perceiving it as something. We don't just do things for no purpose. We have this intentional part of our experience in our actions. You end up building yourself new facticity each time. So freedom is very, very fragile. It's constantly being reformed and remade as you go through. So one of the biggest things that Sartre kind of covered was the idea of authentic choice, that you should make choices for your own sake and no one else's, really. You should not be, since we are subjective, as Kierkegaard said, if you rely on others to make the choice for you, living in the it's kind of similar to living in the aesthetic realm, sphere of existence, as we put it. You let others make the choices for you. Then you are you're giving up some of this freedom, and you are living in what he called bad faith, which is where you are acting out of unfreedom rather than out of freedom. But he said it's very hard not to do that. You have this constant angst and this anxiety, which is created by the fact that you're constantly producing all these past contexts, all this facticity, and you also have that amazing degree of freedom surrounding you at all times, which is kind of overwhelming. One of his books, I believe, although I may be wrong, I have to say I've not been courageous enough to try and get through one, because I am very lazy.
Acting in bad faith there, Tom.
I am, probably, yeah. But is this idea that you stand on the cliff overlooking some rocks, and you have the ability to jump off. You can go, and you have this freedom to leap off, and it's that kind of overwhelming realization that you have this undeniable, to him, freedom that creates so much angst in us every second we exist. Do you want to talk a little bit about De Beauvoir and her relation to Hegel as well as her other things?
Yeah.
I can discuss some perhaps of the ethics afterwards, but you go on to De Beauvoir.
I just wanted to cover, when we mentioned existence precedes essence, I think it's important to analyse the context and of where that came from and what that truly means. So for most of philosophical history, a lot of people argued for the idea of essence precedes existence. And the argument for that is one as follows. I'll give a simplified analogy. When you think of a fork, you think of its purpose, the purpose of eating food, before you actually consider the existence of the fork. And in that sense, the essence of a fork precedes the existence of a fork, in the same way that, because the purpose of the fork is actually more important than its very existence, to its identity at least. However, when we talk about the problem of humans and of our existence, most existentialists look at human nature and the human condition as sort of tabula rasa, in the sense that we aren't really born with any innate values or meaning or purpose, and that, yes, actually existence is all that there actually is. And Sartre doesn't only extend this at birth, and other existentialist thinkers, of course, but Sartre also extends this to our relation with the present, with the future, and the past, in the sense that Sartre saw progression through time in a very interesting way. At any given moment, Sartre said, you may have your essence, which is essentially a generalization of who you are as a person in relation to, one, your facticity, how you're limited by your environment, two, how other people see you and how other people generalize you, and 3, just generally how you've acted. So let's say a knife, which is actually easier. A knife is a prime example of essence preceding existence, because when we think of a knife and its identity and what it means to essentially a knife, the idea and the purpose of a knife cutting is more important than the very existence of that knife. On the other hand, humans are very different, and existentialists saw humans as tabula rasa, in this idea that we all start with no actual innate values or nature, but that through our free will we develop our own essence. And this extends not only from birth, but actually to the present. So in any given moment in time, Sartre argued that you may have your facticity, where you're limited by your past. You may have a past tendency, or generally just be like lazy, or be a bad person. But that doesn't limit you from using your free will right now, your very existence, to be a different person in the future. And that's paramount to the ideas of the free will and the freedom of existentialism. And I might move into to talk about De Beauvoir now, unless you want to talk about the wars or something you were talking about.
Oh, I was just going to mention it's important to remember the historical context that these were in. So, most of the work of Sartre and De Beauvoir was in or around the 40s, 50s, and 60s. So they just lived through the Second World War, one of the most bloody conflicts in human history, or if not the most bloody conflict in human history. And this kind of shook a lot of people. There was growing atheism in society, or growing realization that perhaps God wasn't this universal figure, and was perhaps more. There was more of the kind of sense that Kierkegaard had of you having to come to God rather than He coming to you. So it's just an interesting thing to note. Go on about De Beauvoir then.
Yeah, so De Beauvoir, I'm not well acquainted with her work, and I think you have some stuff about the ethics of ambiguity. But what I know so far of De Beauvoir is the idea. Well, she was essentially, as the partner of Sartre, she developed and criticized a lot of his work, and their works are essentially linked fundamentally, and they're very similar. But one of the ideas that De Beauvoir developed from Sartre and from similar thinkers is the idea that authentic experience is one of individuality, but also for me to properly be able to actualize and develop and carry out my desires, I need the cooperation of other people. And that's why De Beauvoir and Sartre believed that the only way to truly be free as an individual and to be authentic is if one's comrades are also free and able to cooperate with them. And that drives a lot of the revolutionary politics of the 20th century, because this idea of collectivism built up from existentialism is what drove the drive to pursue socialism and communism in the 20th century. And that's quite interesting. You also have De Beauvoir was much more than Sartre. She read a lot about Hegel, and you'll see Hegel's influence throughout the entirety of existentialism, actually, even though a lot of existentialist thinkers tried to reject Hegel, because he was just the German idealist movement was just massively influential upon later philosophy. And every time we see a contradiction or a contrast within this, for example, the absurd, we can to some degree express it in terms of a dialectic, in terms of two ideas clashing to reach a synthesis, a new idea. So
Can I just mention on the point of Hegel? Sorry, I don't know if you're about to go, but the idea of you having to only know yourself through the eyes of the other, of other people. So unlike Sartre, who came from related to Descartes' view that you could find yourself through introspection, hence the famous "I think, therefore I am." Hegel and De Beauvoir believed that you could only find oneself, except you were existing through the recognition of others. And that an interesting thing about that is the idea of shame.
Yeah.
When you peep, I think the example is a peeping Tom looking through the door hole in a bathroom. The fact that you feel, and then he gets caught. The fact that you feel that shame is indicative that there are others existing.
yeah,
In the world, And that's very important, because the way you have to realise yourself and then thus realise your own agency and your own subjectivity is through partially objectifying yourself in the first place by allowing someone else to define you and say that you're real. So it's very interesting. You carry on. That was just one bit I wanted to mention.
So yes, so Hegel's influence was seen widely in de Beauvoir's work, and that drove her idea of this dialectic between facticity, which is us being limited by our circumstances, and transcendence, which is us trying to look beyond this world and try to exceed our limits. And de Beauvoir, and this later seeped into Sartre's work, believed in this oscillation between us constantly being restricted by the world's circumstances and us trying to constantly exceed us. So it's constantly exceed it. And there's this, it's jumping from side to side, and that is the human condition, this dialectic. And yeah, that drove her ideas of, and in a sense, that's also absurd. This constant trying to exceed our capabilities while always being limited by circumstance. And another thing about de Beauvoir is that she sparked the foundations of the second wave feminist movement, because she, through existentialism, managed to actualize and develop a theory of feminism, in the sense that she very much believed, famously she said, one is not born a woman, one becomes a woman. And this came from existentialist thinking, actually, in the sense that de Beauvoir saw all existence, all people, as fundamentally the same. We're all people who've been cast into the world. Remember this idea of Geworfenheit from Heidegger. We've all been cast into the world, left alone. And men, women, people of different classes, people of different races, we're all existentially the same. But society prescribes different conditions to us and treats us differently and gives us different essences. And that's how de Beauvoir had this idea of society makes one a woman. Society, in a sense, imposes restrictions, and that it doesn't need to be that way. And that was quite revolutionary in the 20th century, with her ideas of existentialist feminism. And I think that she had some ideas about the ethics of ambiguity that you might want to cover.
Oh yeah, so her ethical system was kind of built around the kind of tensions existent in what's called ambiguity. So this ambiguity is kind of the same kind of contradictions that I've mentioned before. The fact that your relations with other people objectify them, but at the same time you would not be able to interact with them, and they objectify you at the same instance, because they project their own interpretations of what you are. And it's kind of very relates to the Hegelian concepts of the self. But the consequence of that was that the ways she basically wrote about the ways not to live, which were ways in which you invest yourself in others. The passionate man, I think, is one of them, who does not who commits himself to some project, but that thus defines himself in terms of another. So, for example, if your aim in life is to love your wife or your romantic partner, you are in effect inhibiting your own freedom, and to an extent theirs, by making yourself defined in terms of the other. And he has other she even has other ways of not living, such as the adventurer who never builds anything, never uses his own freedom, just goes along with whatever takes his fancy. And from there, she builds up a very interesting view of ethics, because that was one thing that was often criticised about Sartre in the 50s and 60s. He wrote some notes on ethics, but it was kind of vague, and there was a lot of people going, well, if we all just listen to you existentialists, we're going to end up in a society where there are no rules, where we move to nihilism. That was a criticism, I think, made by a lot of postmodernists. But ultimately, they did try and devise some form of ethics. But the thing is, there could never be a deontological view, which is a rules-based view on ethics from an existentialist, because that is very much impinging on one's freedom. And that relates as well to their view of ethics, because the ethics does relate to the view of ethics. Yes, that's how that works. No, it relates very much to their view of politics, and thus the old. Even if they can't give you a way to live your life, the best way to do is to preserve the most freedom of others, so you can interact without having to objectify others. And the way to do that is to, in their mind, create a socialist or communist community, and which would allow people to come from their own free terms to performing actions, doing projects, and interact with others freely rather than dependent upon the coercion that comes in our society. And so that kind of ambiguity is what is a key theme throughout her ethics, and is that's her ethics summarized briefly. I guess, have you got anything else to say on De Beauvoir, or should we move on to absurdism?
I don't have anything else to say. Well, actually, I think one last thing we could say about De Beauvoir. We've talked about her a lot, actually, but when you talk about
she's the only female we've got on there, which is a bit of a shame. So
yeah, unfortunately. But this idea of being changed to the essence of others and thereby being reduced to one's own essence rather than one's existence is also shown in more of De Beauvoir's feminist writings, where she writes about how, for a long period of history, the woman was chained to the man, in the sense that the woman was always the other of the man, and in the sense she was defined by what the man was not.
Oh yes, that's very
restricted by material conditions rather than free will. And she definitely pioneered feminist theory through the use of existentialism. But I think we can move on to Camus now and the absurd.